Hello, welcome to the webinar. It's the first time that I've used this platform. It's the first time I've done a webinar. I have spoken in public many times, but this is a bit of a new experience for me. If you wouldn't mind just saying a hi or a hello on the message bar, just so that I know that you're actually there. And I'll just give people a few minutes just to log on. And then we'll get started. No, just check that's not. Okay, so I'll start off with a bit of an introduction to me. Thank you for signing up for this webinar today. As I say, I have been speaking in public for the last couple of years at the Asia Pacific International School Conference, Dyslexia Association Hong Kong very kindly invited me to speak last year, and I'm due to do another talk. Virus, hopefully it will still go ahead despite the virus, but I'm due to be speaking for the Dyslexia Association again at the football club at the beginning of March on working memory. A little bit about me, and very quick because I want to get on with the materials. So I'm Helen Trathui. I've been teaching for 26 years now, 18 years in inclusion and special needs. My particular interest is dyslexia, and it's partly, as some people know, because I'm dyslexic myself. I didn't realise I was dyslexic as a child. My teachers thought I was lazy and I wasn't trying hard enough. And I struggled. Obviously I've trained to be a teacher, but I did struggle at university, and I struggled with the paperwork when I first started teaching. And it was only when my head teacher suggested that I trained to be a dyslexia specialist did I realise that I was dyslexic, which sounds very funny, but it's true. And I can remember sitting at the lecture, looking at all the criteria and thinking, I do that, and I do that, and I do that. And, you know, on the first training, I did manage to dismiss it. I thought, well, probably lots of people do these things. But by the time I did the second training, I realised that I was dyslexic, and it also made a lot of my childhood and early adult experiences make sense. And it certainly makes my life make sense now, because there's various things that I struggle with still as an adult. So today's talk is kind of part one of the talk that I did at the Hong Kong Dyslexia Association. So today we're just going to focus on early identification of dyslexia. And part two, which I hope you will join me for, is on the 27th of February, and I will do more about the actual early intervention, so the practical things you can do. But as a webinar, you can't do an hour's talk. So I'm aiming that hopefully this will last about half an hour of me talking, and then doing some Q&A. Please feel free to type in your questions as they come to you. I will either save them till the end, or I will answer them as we go along. And as I say, this is the first time I've used this format, so please just forgive me if it doesn't quite go to plan, but I'm sure you'll still get lots of interesting information from it. So I think the first part, the first very important part is why. Is the why. Why should we identify early? Because in my experience, particularly in the last 18 years, I find that people are very reluctant to identify early, both parents and teachers. And I think for a number of reasons. Partly, a lot of people think any problems children are experiencing early on will just go away. There's still this idea of the kind of late bloomer, as it were. And I have to quite honestly say, in my 26 years experience, there are very, very few late bloomers. Those children who struggle early on in school continue to struggle all the way through school. But we can definitely make their struggles less. I think another reason is that we're worried about labelling. But again, the reality is that if we don't label correctly, other people will mislabel. So children themselves, I teach reception children every day, apart from when we've got the virus, of course. But I teach reception children every day, and you can already see in their faces that they're worried that they're not getting things as quickly as other people. They can see that other children already know their alphabet, and they can't remember even the letters in their own name. So most children will quite quickly know that there's kind of something wrong, and they might mislabel themselves. They might think they're stupid. They might think there's something wrong with them. Teachers often think, that some dyslexic children are very articulate, not all, but they think perhaps the child's being lazy, they can't be bothered. So there's all sorts of mislabeling going on if we don't label. So that's one reason for labeling, for identifying early. The other reason, obviously, sorry, I'm just going to check my notes. This is what's a bit weird about this format, is that I have to have my notes kind of next to me. So if you see me look down, it's just me checking that I haven't missed out an important point. I think another worry is that there's not much we can do. So some people don't want to identify children at the age of 3, 4, 5, because they genuinely think there's not much that you can do to help till later on. And again, that really isn't true. There's so much that you can do right from when a child's born if you think they might be dyslexic. So the sooner that you can work it out and do things, the better. And also the interventions, which I'll talk about more next time, are not harmful. If we do mislabel, and I have to say in my experience, it rarely happens, it's not harmful. So, as you can see on the slide, these are some reasons to identify early. The interventions are just much easier. You can do lots of game-based interventions, which the children just think are fun. They're much more effective at an early age. And the gap, for those of you who are teachers, I don't know if you are, or parents or just interested people, the gap develops very, very quickly, very rapidly, particularly in our education system as it is. So if we don't identify early, the gap will widen very, very quickly. And that then affects the child's self-esteem and how they feel about themselves. And it makes it harder to catch up. So these are all good reasons why we should try and identify early. On my next couple of slides, there's some evidence which you might be interested in. So some people think you can't identify early. The first quote comes from this American agency, the National Institute of Health. And there are lots of assessments now that are effective from the age of 5 onwards. So we certainly can identify very early. And the reality, as you can see from the study that was done by Valentino at Johns Hopkins University, he did a study and he found that if you did interventions with year 1 children, grade 1, so that's grade 2 in the English system, if you did daily interventions, those children could very rapidly catch up, even if they were dyslexic. But the reality is, if you don't intervene early, some of those children will never catch up. They will struggle throughout their whole school career. So I think if we can do something early, it has to be of a benefit. So moving on, there's lots of research. So the other reason for identifying early is literally because we can. Nadine Gabb has been on the forefront of a lot of research in America. And she's been involved in doing brain scans on children from babies, literally from babies, all the way through school. And obviously the children that she's chosen to scan, she's looked for children where there's dyslexia in the family as potential dyslexic students' children. And then she's looked at ones who are considered to be normal, though I don't think dyslexia is not normal. But she found 2 control groups. And the differences in the brain scans are there almost from the beginning. The thing that she noticed is there's a particular part of the brain which is the connection, and I have to check my notes here so I get it right. So, and I'm not even sure, because I am dyslexic, so I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to say this properly, but the arcuate fasciculus, and do look up her website. I mean, that's probably much better than me trying to pronounce it wrongly. But there's a part of the brain which basically connects the area where language sounds are mapped onto the written counterparts. So that's our kind of phonetical awareness, if you like. The connection between that and the part we use for reading fluency and comprehension, the grey matter in that area for dyslexics is not as well developed. So basically the part of the brain which allows us to make the connections and make that understanding of sounds and letters automatic, shall we say, it is not functioning so well for dyslexics. And that can be seen, as I say, right from babies all the way through to older children. And as I say, I do encourage you, if you Google Nadine Garb, you can read her research in a bit more detail. Alongside that, MIT have also been doing some research, and that's looking at the way that our brain processes sensory input. So they did a study where subjects looked at different faces, and it looked at how the brain changed and reacted to seeing those faces. And then they also did people's voices. And it was found that people who are dyslexic don't process those images or those sounds as deeply. So for most of us, I say we, not me, because I'm dyslexic, but for someone who's not dyslexic, when they see something or they hear something, their brain processes it, and then it becomes kind of automated. The brain actually adapts so that it remembers it. And so the next time they see it or hear it, they don't actually process it in the same way. They've kind of almost got an automatic memory. And I guess that's probably why dyslexics, you know, when they see a word or see something they've seen before, they don't remember they've seen it before. Whereas a typical child, if they have seen a picture before, they would recognize they'd seen the picture before. If they sound out a word, cat, the next time they see the word cat, they would remember they'd sounded it out, and they would just say cat instead of sounding out again. And we know that. I think a lot of us will know that from our experience, where a dyslexic child might sound out a word multiple times in the same book. And that this is because of the lack of automaticity for dyslexics. But again, all of these signs can be shown very early on. And I'm not suggesting that we brain scan children to see if they're dyslexic or not, but certainly the signs are there very early on. And so there's no reason why we shouldn't try and look for it. Again, if we identify early, it uses just less resources. Most of the early activities are game-based. They're very easy to do. And as I say, if you sign up for the second webinar, I will show you a lot of those practical resources. As I say, time doesn't allow for me to do everything today. But it takes a lot longer and a lot more resources to catch up if you identify later, whereas it's much simpler if you identify early. So I hope that's kind of convinced you that it's a good idea to identify early. So that's the kind of why. So now we're going to look at the different signs. So as I say, it's interesting that the brain scans show that you can tell if someone's dyslexic almost from birth. And that's because dyslexia is a neurological condition, and it's hereditary. Though obviously not all children, you've got probably a 50-50 chance of being dyslexic. Not all children of someone who's dyslexic will be dyslexic. But there's a good chance, and it should be something you're looking out for. So one of the earliest signs, as you can see from this slide, is to do with speech. So again, not all people who've got delayed speech are dyslexic. So, the two can be separate, but it is one of the earliest signs. So those children who are always kind of saying thing me, and they mispronounce a word. I have to say, when I was younger, I thought that a handbag was a handbag. And I always puzzled why you would call a handbag, because it wasn't made of ham. But that's what it sounded like to me. And so it is those children where they, they can't remember the word for things, or they use the wrong word. And often they're, and you can see that me doing the same thing, where the word is on the tip of my tongue, but I can't quite get the right word out. And that can be seen almost as soon as children start to talk. So you can see 60% of dyslexics are late talkers. Another sign is to do with coordination. So again, not all dyslexics have coordination difficulties. I do. But as we know, lots of dyslexic people are great sports people, are good at dance, can be very well coordinated. But there is a good proportion, again, this is less, 20%, who have coordination difficulties. But these are the children who, they never put the shoe on the right foot. So, they might put their left foot, a shoe on their right foot, and they don't even seem to realise. Very early on, when children are learning how to dress, they're the children who struggle to do up the buttons, to put a zip together. Later on, they're the ones who can't tie their shoelaces. My son still has trouble tying his shoelaces. So those are some of the early signs. And, sometimes children find it difficult to learn to ride a bike, for example, because of these coordination difficulties. So again, those things can be seen very early on, though obviously there are people who have these difficulties who aren't dyslexic. Well, the dyslexia and dyspraxia, I would argue, are very interlinked. And I'm not sure that you necessarily need to tell the difference between whether dyslexic or dyspraxic. Someone who's dyspraxic will typically have more difficulties with their coordination, more difficulties with what we call motor planning. So they kind of know what to do. So they know they've got to go from A to B, but they can't break a task up into the steps to do it. And so it can be, particularly if they're doing schoolwork, they might know all the methods to do the schoolwork, but they can't work out how to work through the sequence and do it. I maybe will come back to that. That was a question, by the way, and I'll maybe come back to it a bit more. But typically, if you are dyspraxic, you will have a lot of the same difficulties as a dyslexic person. So you'll have those spelling and reading difficulties. It's just you have the coordination difficulties as well. Okay, so on to our next slide. These are the earliest indicators. And again, you're looking, lots of children have difficulties. I appreciate that. What you're looking for is a cluster of activities, of difficulties. So, I often hear people say, oh, well, how do you know that they're dyslexic? But you're looking for more than one thing. I would say, if a child has maybe half of these indicators that are here, then there's a good chance they're dyslexic. If they've literally just got one of those things, then it may be there might be another reason for their difficulties. It could be lack of exposure. It could be another related learning difficulty. But certainly, if there's a family history of dyslexia, then I wouldn't wait. I would literally try and start doing some of the interventions straight away. And as you'll see next time, the interventions can be done from about age of 3 onwards. And they don't do any harm. They're just fun things to do that will help the child. So a lot of these signs you can actually see in a typical nursery. And the thing is that teachers are so, and parents, but teachers more so, are so familiar with these things. Every class they've ever taught has got children who do these things, that sometimes people don't associate with dyslexia. Dyslexia is a lot more common than people perceive. The British Dyslexia Association estimates that about 10% of people are dyslexia. If you take some of the more related aspects of it, so just visual processing difficulties, auditory processing difficulties, coordination difficulties, then it could affect up to 20% of children who might have some of those difficulties, but not all the dyslexic difficulties. So that whole thing I've already spoken about muddling or mishearing words, trouble following instructions, and even very simple instructions. So, you know, if you've got a child and you ask them to do 2 things, you know, go and get your bag and then put your shoes on, and they start putting their shoes on, well, they haven't processed both instructions. And that is an early sign of dyslexia. Things like, you know, when you've got very young children and you're doing a shape sorter and you're trying to sort the shape, those children who can't differentiate between the shapes or have difficulty remembering the names of the shapes or difficulty remembering colours, those are all early signs of dyslexia. And then you've got the left and right. I confess is still a big problem for me. If I have to give directions to someone, I have to literally wave my hand around to work out whether it's left or right. But those children who are very unsure of left or right, and they're not maybe sure of which hand to use for different things, a lot of them remain actually ambidextrous. And that, I mean, that's okay. It's not a problem, but it is an early sign. They can be seen as being a bit clumsy. They might bump into things. You know, if you're in the early years and you're doing kind of things where they're balancing on a bench, there'll be the children who are wobbling. You know, if you ask them to hop, they might actually struggle just to hop. So all these signs are there very early on, but a lot of people just kind of dismiss them as being normal. But I would say if you're showing multiple signs, not all of these, but multiple, then there's a very high chance that the person is dyslexic. Do feel free to post any questions or comments as I'm talking. As I say, it's a bit of a bizarre experience because you can see me and I can't see you. And I'm so used to getting kind of feedback as I'm going along. And also, if there was anything you really wanted to know today, also do feel free to type that in and I will try and add that in. So moving on, for those of you who don't know, really there are 3 main types of dyslexia. So there is visual dyslexia, and then there's auditory dyslexia, and then there's people who have both. And the ones who have both are the ones who people immediately will know are dyslexic. They're the ones who generally in school get identified the first because they haven't got other skills to compensate with. Other children are either have more of the visual difficulties or they have more of the auditory difficulties. So I have auditory dyslexia. I find things like phone calls very difficult. I don't process that information very well. I need to see things. You know, if people give me a series of directions, there's no way I'm going to find anything. I need to see it on a map. And then the flip side is the slide that you've got here. So there's some children who predominantly have these visual difficulties. And you can see these as soon as they start learning to read and write. So they are the children in school where you have the flashcards and you're trying to teach them those camera words, as some people call them, or the sight words. And some children pick them up so quickly. Children with the visual difficulties, you could show them the word "the" every day and they wouldn't remember the word "the." because their brain just doesn't process the information like that. And that's why you have to use different methods. They're the children that when you're starting those first words, they will actually transpose the order of the letters. And it's fascinating. I see it every day. Some people think it's a bit of a myth, but when I'm I work with reception year 1 and year 2 children, and some older children, but predominantly those. And I see it all the time. So they would read something like, they would say spot for a word like stop. And you think, well, that's not the same. But somehow their brain scrambles the order of the letters. And so they end up reading it wrong. And they are the ones who muddle. And I know B and D is not a good indicator of dyslexia, because I know a lot of children do that early on. But if they are muddling up B and D, but more so things like I and J, F and T, they're the children who can't seem to remember the word letters by sight. When you're first doing things like Jolly Phonics or Read Write Inc, they're the ones who struggle to get the alphabet and really rely on the picture that's on the other side. If you use something like Letterland, again, they would rely on knowing the picture. I'm going to come on to auditory dyslexia, so I will answer your question, Grace, in a moment. So these are the children who will sound out words again and again. And again, it's fascinating. As I say, I work with these children day in, day out. And it seems incredible because they will know lots of facts about all sorts of things. They can tell you all about what they did at the weekend. And yet, they sound out the word cat on one page and they sound it out on the next page and the next page and the next page. And it doesn't go in. And then equally when they do get, and this is a little bit later on, so maybe when they're in year 2 and they're doing some writing, they would spell the same word incorrectly multiple different ways, because they really haven't got a memory of how that word should be spelt. When they're reading, they will often make visual substitutions. So they'll, as you can see there, the example driver for diver. And they might miss whole words in a sentence as well. They might skip over words in the sentence. So moving on to the auditory difficulties. So going to Grace's question, it's very difficult to tell the difference between auditory dyslexia and auditory processing difficulties. I take the philosophy of kind of having dyslexia as an umbrella term. So I prefer to put all of these difficulties underneath the one umbrella and say that they are interrelated. Other people want to split everything up. So they want to say, well, that person's dyslexic and they have auditory processing difficulties. This person is dyslexic and they have visual processing difficulties. And they want to split it, so this person's dyslexic and they have dysgraphia. In terms of how you intervene with a child, I'm not sure it makes a huge amount of difference. And I always take the very pragmatic approach. I only want to know what problems the child's got so I can find a solution. So I can find activities that will suit that child and help them make progress. So I think whether you split it or you put it together, to me, it doesn't matter. There are children who just have auditory processing difficulties and not dyslexia. And I would say that they are the children who maybe don't have difficulty with spelling or reading. So they do actually pick up reading and spelling okay. But they are the children who find it difficult to follow instructions. They are the children who will muddle up a word. So they might think that chess and chest are the same, or bag and back. So they will muddle up words that sound the same. I mean, I have to tell you a funny story. One of my friends, and this has just happened recently, one of my friend's wife is called Ning. And I have, for the last 6 months, been calling her Ling, because I honestly thought that was her name. It was only when we shared details on our phone that I realised I had got it wrong for the last 6 months and no one had told me. So it is that kind of muddling up of words that affect someone with auditory processing more. Also, if you've got auditory processing difficulties, you will find background noise very difficult. So within the classroom setting, you would need to sit near the teacher. You'd need to make sure you had eye contact with the teacher. And as I say, you might then, if you've just got an auditory processing difficulty, you might not have difficulties with reading and writing as well. You might just have those difficulties with following the instructions. But many children who are dyslexic have the two together. And then we have to try and help them with a more visual approach. And you'll see, if you do sign up for my next webinar, which I hope you will, I will talk about how we use the stronger sense to help the weaker one. So if you are stronger visually, then use that to compensate for your weaker auditory, and vice versa. But that's where the children who have visual and auditory difficulties, then, you know, it's tough. It's tough to help them. And there we have to take a much more hands-on kinesthetic approach, and perhaps use more movement in learning. So that's a tough challenge. Okay, so just some practical ones, which you might see when you first start doing any letter work or any spelling. So these are actual ones taken from the children I work with. So you've got drink and jacket. So where you can clearly see the jacket, I hope you can see the letters. So that's an I and an N. So they've got the jack, but then they're trying to visualize. It's because they're trying to use their visual skills. So they kind of know what the word looks like, and they're trying to find some letters they think might work, but they're not using the auditory side at all to help them. Again, sorry for the camera angle. This is because they are real examples that were taken while the children were working. So you've got scarf, where you can see the T and the F have been swapped over. And then drink, where you can see the whole word is back to front. And again, that is quite a common sign. As I say, not the B's and D's. Muddling up B's and D's is not a good indicator of dyslexia. If a child does that, it doesn't mean they're dyslexic at all. You have to look at all of these signs. If that's the only sign they're showing, they're probably not dyslexic. They need to be doing the other things that we've talked about already. But the whole word going backwards, I always find quite fascinating. And it's because of the way the brain is processing. They honestly don't know it's wrong, because as far as their brain is concerned, it is the same thing. One of the dyslexic strengths is that we see the world as a whole, and we see the whole picture. And so the idea of left to right is really doesn't compute with us. And also, just to say that reading and writing, they're not natural. Unlike speaking, learning to speak is completely natural. And if you're surrounded by people speaking a language, you will naturally start to speak that language. Reading and writing is completely different. It is a human construct, if you like. And we've made the conventions around reading and writing. So we're the ones who say that you read from left to right. There's actually no reason why we should. And so a young person's brain has to be trained, that's the convention. But a dyslexic brain just takes longer and more convincing to train them in that. So here you are. These are the ones that, as I say, these are the ones that everyone spots straight away. I hope you can see that very bizarre spelling at the top, which is genuinely soft. I don't know quite where the T came from, but the A was instead of an O. The TH is obviously it's back to front, but it was because the child thought it was a sound rather than a sound, and then the T is correct at the end. But it's the two together. So not really hearing the sounds properly, and then muddling up the letters. And the quick is the same. Obviously, when you say quick, you can almost hear a w sound in it. So it's understandable, but it's kind of misinterpreting the sounds. And then you've got the Q and the U, the Q, P for the Q, which is opposite. So these are the ones we spot. These children are the ones we spot straight away. So some key observations, apart from the kind of whole reading and writing thing, just simply not remembering the instructions given by a teacher is a really strong indicator of dyslexia or another learning difficulty. And that difficulty is something that children with ADHD and children with autism also struggle with. But if we all know who those children are, if you are teachers, I'm not sure if you all are teachers, but if you are a teacher, you know that when you give a set of instructions, there's always one child who's going to come to you and say, "What do I do now, miss?" Or "What do I do now, sir?" And we know who those children are. And it's because they have working memory difficulties, which is one of the key indicators of dyslexia or another learning difficulty. So we shouldn't ignore that. And equally, we shouldn't get cross because it genuinely isn't their fault. We said too many words for their brain to hold on to or process adequately. So they are, again, and it's frustrating, they're the children where they can't remember what you did the day before. So you might have done something really clearly, step by step. You think, oh, everyone's got it. Next day, do you remember doing X? And no, they don't remember it. And it is, as I say, it's because of the working memory. And if you're lucky enough to come to my talk at the football club, I will talk more extensively about working memory. But, it's because they're not holding things in their head long enough to process it. And because they can't process it, they can't store it long term. And so it's gone. It's like Groundhog Day. It's a new day every day, and they genuinely don't remember. They also often have a very poor sense of time. So they're the children where they won't remember what day of the week it is. They get confused when the weekend's coming, or as soon as you've started the school day, is it lunchtime yet? Because they really don't have that sort of sense of time. And they're the children equally who will forget equipment. I mean, I confess I leave a trail all around my school. I'll take my diary somewhere, or I'll leave my favourite pen in another room. And I honestly have no recollection of where I've left them. I have to retrace my steps around the school until I find them. And so these are the children who, will forget equipment for school. They'll leave their jumper somewhere, but they've got no idea where they left their jumper. And it's a genuine difficulty. That's the thing. I think that's what's difficult for teachers, because often these children can seem very bright in other ways and very capable. And then it seems like laziness and carelessness. They can't remember these things. And these indicators are probably even better indicators, I would say, than the reading and writing difficulties. Yeah, lots of children. There's just been a question, do dyslexic children also have concentration problems? Yes. And it's often kind of chicken and egg, shall we say. Sometimes it's hard to know whether they're having trouble concentrating because the things you're asking them to do are just too overwhelming. That they're overloaded by the information or the task that you've asked them to do. And so therefore they just can't carry on concentrating. I know a lot of teachers get very frustrated because they're saying, well, but they didn't even try to listen. But if you can imagine that someone says something and you're only going to remember one word of it, quite honestly, would you listen to all of it? And then you're going to have to ask someone what to do anyway. It's not laziness. But then equally, a lot of children who've got dyslexia also have ADHD. So, I mean, that's the case for me. I have dyslexia and I've got ADD as well. That's not unusual. So then of course, that makes it even harder to access the information and to stay on task. So there's a lot of overlap with that. But I think the important thing to say is it's not laziness. It's not people not trying. And I think, honestly, if people could realise what it's like to have working memory difficulties, which is the number one difficulty, I would say, with dyslexia, then they maybe would be a bit more sympathetic. So, yeah, moving on. So, yeah, sorry. So I kind of typically, in my dyslexic fashion, I've jumped to the next slide. So these are two of my favourite cartoons. I love Peanuts. But this is literally what it is like for some children in the class. It's like the teacher going, and I hope this isn't happening to you now, I hope you are staying with me, but it is literally like someone going, wow, 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 wow. Because the trouble with working memory is that it is, for each individual, it is finite. So if you have a working memory of 3 seconds, well, you do have a working memory of 3 seconds. And if the teacher says something longer than 3 seconds, it has gone. I've seen it many times. I remember a teacher saying to a child, don't cut the shape out. But because that was too long, all the child heard was cut the shape out. And so that's what they did, because the instruction actually was too long for them. The thing is to try and bypass the working memory. So if you can make it into more of a story, that helps to bypass the working memory, because our episodic memory is different. So when we're listening to a story, we're using a different part of the brain. So if things can seem more like a story, if you can connect it to something they already know, they're not having to use quite so much of that working memory to work out what's being said. And obviously the whole idea of multisensory. So if you're showing someone something, they're doing something, all of those things will help. And as I say, if you come to my talk on working memory, I will talk much more about that. So these are all signs of working memory difficulties. And these, I would say, probably affect dyslexic people as much as the difficulty in remembering words to write or to read. So they can't remember more than one instructions. So the important thing is to accept that. So just give them one instruction. Okay, you might give the whole class 3 instructions, but then turn to that particular child and just give them the one instruction, because they're not going to remember it. And the danger is that they won't remember anything if your working memory is overloaded. So they are the children where they start writing the sentence and they forget what they were going to write, or they leave out words. So, I know teachers are very fond of saying, oh, check your writing, make sure it makes sense. But I mean, these children honestly don't know that they've missed out a word because they've forgotten what they wanted to say. So very often bits will be missed out. So it can affect as much as blending. So if you do a scheme like read, write, ink, for example, and you're sounding out a word, so something like trip, it, that can be enough to overload a child's working memory. They can't keep 4 sounds in their head and blend them. They can do trip. So one of the things I do a lot of is using flip books. I don't know if you know, where you have the onset and rhyme. So you're chunking the words rather than doing it as separate sounds. And people need to be aware of that when they are trying to teach children to read, that if they have working memory difficulties, they may only be able to keep 2 things in their head at the same time, 3 tops. So then if you're asking them to blend a longer word, they just simply can't do it. So again, the reading comprehension can be affected because literally by the time they get to the end of a sentence, they've forgotten the beginning of the sentence, which also stops them using that whole contextual part of reading. Because much as we love phonics, when you're reading, a lot of children predict what the sentence is going to say, or they guess the word, and that's okay. They guess the word from the context. But if you think you're struggling to decode the words and then you actually can't remember what you've just read, you can't use context to work out what the rest of the sentence is, or work out that tricky word that everyone else has worked out. Not being able to give a verbal message. So, I mean, I remember this vividly as a child because I was a very sensible child, of course. And my teachers often asked me to take a message to another teacher. And I can remember the first time I did it, I got to the other teacher's class and I really couldn't remember what the message was at all. It was terribly embarrassing. And I had to go back to my teacher and ask what the message was again. I then learned that if I wanted to be able to do it, I had to literally repeat the message to myself over and over and again until I got to my destination. So these are genuine problems. And as I say, they still affect, even as an adult, it still affects me. And so if also in primary school, we often do activities that have got more than one part, of course. We might be writing a story that's got several parts. We might be making something, and you've got to do, you've got to make the head, and then you've got to put the arms on. But they will often lose track of an activity. Also affects things like maths. So they, partway through working a calculation out, they will lose track of where they are, and they'll miss a step and then get the wrong answer. So I hope you can see that actually those working memory difficulties can have much more of a profound, I know this wasn't a talk about working memory difficulties, but actually they can have the biggest effect, and they are the strongest indicators that there is a learning difficulty. Working memory difficulties, as I say, do affect autistic children and ADHD, so it might not be they're dyslexic, but it definitely is a sign that there is a learning difficulty that should be identified. So my last very important bit for today is the screening. Because with young children, though, yes, we can assess, and you could send a 5-year-old to an educational psychologist for a formal assessment. I have assessed 5-year-olds, but not formally. I think at a young age, you want to go for a more informal approach, a more play-based approach. And again, we're really just trying to get strengths and weaknesses anyway, because this is all about unlocking the door so that they can have the interventions that will help them be successful. So in that sense, it doesn't matter whether they're dyslexic or not. We're trying to find out why they're finding learning difficulty, what skills are missing, and how best to help them. My favorite screener is the Nessie one. So you can see that on the screen, www.nessie.com. There is a charge to it. I think it's £10 per child, but I think you can actually reuse it. I use it on an iPad, so you can also download it as an app. And there are 6 games which the children play. And I should have probably put it on the slide, might have been easier. So this is actually one of the children's profiles. Sorry, camera, no, that way. Okay. So you can see, you kind of get a graph. This child, as you can see from the graph, has got 4 indicators of dyslexia. So this child really, really is dyslexic. And it turns out they got dysgraphia as well. But it gives you, so that if you take Nessie's example, they have 6 main areas that they're looking for dyslexia. So they have working memory, phonological awareness, processing speed, visual sequential memory, auditory sequential memory, and visual memory. So those are what they consider the 6 key indicators of dyslexia. But again, you're not expecting a child to have all of those indicators. I would say if they had 3, there's a good chance they're dyslexic. This child, as I say, has got 4 and clearly is dyslexic. But the children don't even know they're being assessed. That's the best thing about it, because it's a series of games. And this is also very helpful in terms of talking to a parent, because you can then say, well, this is the part that is causing the problem. So this child's got big problems with their working memory, and they also have trouble with their visual sequential memory, which is why they can't remember words like said, for example, because they can't remember that's the series of letters. But they also have auditory sequential memory difficulties as well. So they're one of the children who has the auditory and visual difficulty, which is why the dyslexia is affecting them so much. So that's a very good and easy one to do. It's one you can even recommend to parents. If your school doesn't really believe in identifying early, you can just give the website to the parents. They can actually log on as a parent and buy the assessment and do it at home. So I would really recommend that one. My other old favourite, which is on there, and there we are, camera, is the Aston Index. Now, I was recently told by the British Dyslexia Association that this is a bit too out of date. And so this alternative, which is this big black book, which you can see is on the screen as well, was recommended to me. This is the up-to-date version. But in reality, in the appendix, the assessments are just the same. So again, this is trying to get a profile of a child. So I'll show you an example of a couple of things. So for example, I hope you can see it. This is a visual discrimination activity. There's the digit span is in this for looking at working memory. There's all sorts of assessments. So you're basically trying to get a profile of the child, strengths and weaknesses. If there are enough weaknesses, then that's a strong indicator of dyslexia. But again, it's trying to work out what area do we need to work on. Then the other one that is very good, and I know there is a computerized version of this. I don't actually have it, but what is called SNAP, there's a computerized version of it. Again, in the back, this has very practical, and you know, the children literally think they're doing a game. So I'm very bad with my camera. You can see why I'm having trouble with left and right here. So this one is for working memory, but it's using words. So you say a series of words and the child has to say the words backwards. Another one that's really good in here is this one to do with visual memory, and it gives you all the pieces. So you show the child this for 5 seconds, and then they have a sheet and they have to see if they can remember which shape they saw. And then in the back, it's got the age norms so that you can work out whether it's a strength or weakness. But again, the reason I recommend these screeners is that none of them seem like you're being tested. So, and I would recommend, I think they're very good to use from the age of 5 to the age of 7, 8 tops. After they're 8, you really need to do a more thorough assessment, and that's a talk for another day. But these ones, the children, I just say to children, oh, we're going to do some puzzle today. You know, and some of the puzzles will see how good your memory is, and we'll see how good you are at remembering things. And they think they're just doing a game with me, and they don't know that they're being tested. And I think that's the best way, because you know, we want children to be relaxed, we want them to perform at their best, and we don't want to feel like there's something wrong in that sense. So these are all really good screeners and very useful to use. So our time is running out, and I'm keen to get on to if there is any more Q&A. So obviously my website and my blog, do have a look at them. Whole wealth of things. I don't earn any money currently out of it. Hope one day I will. But all the resources are free, so please look at them. And then as a British trained teacher, I have to say I do tend to refer to the British Dyslexia Association. But the information on there is very balanced and very practical. It's really worth having a look at the website if you are unsure about dyslexia. They give checklists for all different ages of children. And Understood, I'm sure, is something that that website, I think a lot of people are familiar with. But that's quite a good one to refer parents to, because there's lots of pages that are giving us kind of bullet points where it's easy for a parent to understand what the problem is and what the solution is. Okay, so I don't know if I have to do, let me see if I have to do something else to get question and answered. So please feel free. I'm going to finish the webinar in about 5 minutes. So do give me any comments or any questions that you have, and hopefully you will receive an email where you can sign up for part 2 if you're interested in doing that. The talk at the football club is, I think, supposed to be on the 5th of March, but with the virus, I'm not sure whether we'll be allowed to meet together. If not, I will present it later, and I definitely will do a webinar of it at some point. The best thing to do is to check the Dyslexia Association Hong Kong website. So that is what it's called, Dyslexia Association Hong Kong. If you go onto their website, you will see if and when the talk's happening. So let's see. Hopefully these questions are kind of scrolling. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lucy. So I'm just trying to find some of the questions because unfortunately it kind of scrolled up really probably slightly too quickly. That was the. So can children grow out of dyslexia? I would say no, but we can definitely lessen the symptoms. I didn't have any, if you think as an adult now, I didn't have any intervention for dyslexia as a child. And possibly if I had, the auditory processing, the working memory, and coordination difficulties I have now maybe wouldn't be so pronounced. I mean, I actually can't drive because of my coordination difficulties, but I didn't have any intervention. I would say that the things that affect adults are very different than what affect children. So initially, the things that we see in school are the reading and writing difficulties, and those things definitely can be put right. I see children given the right intervention make really, really rapid progress with their reading. Spelling is much slower. So reading you can almost put right in a year if you do the really intensive work. Certainly 6 months of the right thing, you will see a difference. To a year, you'll already be well on the right track. Spelling takes much, much longer, and writing 2, 3, 4 years of intervention to really see any great inroads, but you can get there. But then as an adult, it's actually not the spelling and reading. I mean, I'm a slow reader and I have to proofread all my work multiple times. But it isn't those things. As I say, it's the auditory processing. It's the difficulty taking phone calls. I muddle up my PIN number. My brain just scrambles the order of things, left and right coordination. So it's often those things that carry on into adulthood, less so the reading and writing. But I do think if you intervene early, you will have less of those difficulties. I think you can do a lot to put it right, to the point where people probably wouldn't even notice. I mean, a lot of the children I work with, by the time they get to year 6, we start working with them in reception. So by the time they get to year 6 or year 7, teachers very often ask me, why are they on the special needs register? Because they seem fine. I would argue the interventions. Thank you, Megan, for your question. I would say the interventions really should happen every day. The key to helping any of these things is little and often. But there are, for older students, there's things like units of sound, which is an online computer program, so they can kind of help themselves a bit more independently. And as long as they're doing some independent practice, and you'd also hope with Key Stage 2 that the children start realising how they learn best. So if they know that something like mnemonics helps them remember the spellings, they can actually make their own dictionary of mnemonics and they can use that. But I would say, realistically, I mean, I work in a school, so the children in Key Stage 2 I typically see twice a week. But in reality, they could really do with intervention every day. Things like toe by toe. So even 10 minutes of toe by toe every day can make a profound difference. There was someone have I missed someone? If I've missed out your question, could you just repost it? I'm just having a little bit of trouble. And then I think I think that the webinar actually will stop because I programmed it for an hour. So I think we've got about 2 minutes left. But it'd be really nice if people could just give me a bit of feedback, because as I say, it's the first time I've used this kind of format of whether you found it useful. Are there other topics you would like me to talk about? Any of those things would be really, really useful. Assessing second language learners, that was a really good question, thank you, is really tricky. That's one of the reasons I actually like the Dyslexia Quest. So that was, going back, that was with Nessie. So maybe if I go back on my slides. So the www.nessie.com. Because it is game-based and the instructions on it are very simple, most of them would the language doesn't make any difference, is what I'm trying to say. You could still find most of the indicators of dyslexia because most of them are not completely language based. Okay, so I'm going to sign off now. Thank you for joining me. You should get a follow-up email. Do feel free to email me if you have any questions or any comments. And I'm going to see if I can work out how to sign off. So do feel free to leave the webinar now if or make a comment. And thank you very much. Bye.